decisions. And of course, we had an inter-peak period where things were a little bit quieter in the country in terms of the outbreak. But of course, unfortunately, we had our second wave that peaked around December, January of 2020, 2021. Now, sadly, in South Africa, the variant was detected somewhere around October by our leading scientists. The Department of Health was informed. And I think it was, in my personal opinion, a little bit disappointing that the public was only informed about the variant around mid-December, which I feel was far too late. This was the type of scientific information that needed to be shared with the public early. This was the type of scientific information that needed to be implemented in terms of governmental decisions and policies. And for one thing, during the December period, we're well aware it's our peak tourism period. It's Christmas holidays, and lots of celebrations. And I think our government had a difficult time balancing, the medical urgency with the economic impact on the country, as well as, ensuring that civil society was allowed to have some level of relaxation and celebration around Christmas. But this is where these difficult decisions really need to be made, So, for example, canceling Christmas might have been a good idea, and perhaps our second wave would not have been as severe as it had been. Informing the public early about the variant, likewise, may have impacted more on reducing the morbidity and mortality we experienced during the second wave. And so, speaking about variants and concerns around variants, the very latest dilemma we're facing is thinking about how we would deal with the scenario where the variant that has emerged in India, that is causing absolute havoc in the health system and causing unprecedented levels of death and illness in the country, and how that is actually going to impact if we were to have that variant imported into South Africa. And so over the last two to 3 days, the media has run a number of different articles relating to this possibility. As things stand, Indian nationals are allowed to leave India in spite of there being quite a serious outbreak of COVID in the country in their second wave. And it is hence not surprising to see, interesting pieces of literature emerging on the tragedy that is occurring in India at various levels, medically, personal loss of friends and family, an unbelievably stressed healthcare system, religious gatherings we know that were permitted in the weeks preceding the second outbreak, involving not just hundreds of people, not thousands of people, but indeed millions of people. And it is this level, of reduction in prevention measures that has contributed to a large extent to the current situation in India. Once again, healthcare professionals are facing difficult decisions in terms of who to treat and who not to treat, and how to allow access to very limited resources within a country that has a strained public healthcare system. So moving away from some of the clinical ethics issues, I think we faced a number of challenges with respect to research. In South Africa in particular, our research ethics committees were stressed beyond their limits. We know that they've worked through the night for several months, attempting to approve as many protocols as possible. They've had to move all their systems from in-person to online, and they've had to make extremely difficult decisions. Again, it was a transition of moving from a system of liberal individualism where we protect the rights of individual participants to looking at the broader picture and common interest and public health ethics. And so for many research ethics committees, they had to now deal with moving away from a detailed individual informed consent process to looking at other ways of obtaining consent, and in some cases where indicated, considering also the need for a waiver of consent altogether, a huge paradigm shift for research ethics committees. And then again, we've had the scenario around vaccines that has dominated the media, dominated journal publications, etc., as we had to face a number of challenges related to vaccines, most of which was developed at warp speed. Again, an unprecedented development. We know that South Africa participated in many of the trials relating to vaccines. AstraZeneca was one of them, J&J as well as Novavax. And we know that there was a degree of disappointment on the part of research participants with respect to the AstraZeneca trials that were conducted fairly early on in South Africa. In particular, the disappointment related to the fact that South Africa had to procure AstraZeneca vaccines at double the cost per dose as many European countries had to. And research participants felt disappointed that despite their participation, researchers had not negotiated for post-trial access or fair benefit sharing agreements upfront, given that at least 2,000 participants sacrificed their time, their health, and their lives to take part in fairly novel vaccine trials in this country. Now, in response to that particular article, we wrote a piece on the importance of negotiation where researchers are concerned. So while some researchers argue that their interest lies only in the science and getting the trials done, and some argued that they have no advocacy role in terms of negotiating for benefit sharing, post-trial access, community-wide access, country-wide access for vaccines, we argue that during a pandemic, researchers and scientists have an obligation to ensure that in addition to conducting the research, should an intervention be found to be efficacious, that it will be made reasonably available to the country, given that access to vaccines is generally poor during this time in South Africa and many other low and middle income countries. By the 1st of February, we know that the first AstraZeneca vaccines arrive, or 1 million doses of them, to much celebration and jubilation in the country. And then, of course, everybody went on looking at how we would distribute these vaccines. We had a phased approach to how they would be allocated, with frontline healthcare workers being prioritized in the first rollout. Sadly, however, despite all the ethical challenges and us having reached agreement in terms of how vaccines would roll out, we were unable to use our first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine, given that an earlier clinical trial conducted in South Africa included only young and middle-aged participants. Hence, the results could not be extrapolated to older participants and to more. And so we had some data, but insufficient data to guide us in terms of vaccine efficacy with respect to the variant. And of course, that we had data that appeared to be unhelpful in terms of how the vaccine would be used in the country. Now, despite the WHO intervening and advising South Africa to continue using the AstraZeneca vaccines, as we know, vaccines were sent to other parts of Africa, raising even more ethical questions, especially since uptake of the AstraZeneca vaccine in other African countries has been poor. And so, there is a perception that if the AstraZeneca vaccine is not good enough for South Africa, is it good enough for any other African country? We do know the basis for sending away the vaccines was related to a large extent to what is the so-called South African variant that may or may not be present in other African countries. But of course, that has been a point of contention And informal reports from other parts of Africa seem to indicate that there is poor uptake. Fortunately, there was Plan B, and we know that there was another arrival of the J&J vaccine in the country. And very quickly, an implementation trial was developed to allow for rollout in terms of access to healthcare workers initially as part of this implementation trial. Now, once again, something that was unprecedented. Research ethics committees were given a very short period of time in which to review these protocols, which were written quite hurriedly as well. Some ethics committees had as little as 2 days in which to make difficult decisions around this trial, because to a large extent, the ethical challenges associated with the implementation study took us back to the days of HIV research in the country. And we all know that there were times during the HIV era in which the only way one could access HIV treatment was via clinical trial. And here again, we found ourselves in a similar situation where the only way one could access a COVID vaccine was via a clinical trial. Usually in clinical trial research, participants ought to have a choice and there ought to be alternatives. But if there is no alternative, then clearly one has no choice. And so many healthcare workers, absolutely desperate for a vaccine, enrolled in the study, accepted a vaccine for which there was not much medium to long-term safety data. And that, of course, is the ethics of desperation. We know that after a period of rollout, our vaccine implementation trials had to be suspended related to thromboembolic phenomena occurring in Europe and in the USA. And while the South African regulatory body had to deliberate over these safety issues, there was a period of suspension. Again, with our Department of Health proceeding with caution, which is also important where there are safety issues. And when they were satisfied that one could continue in terms of the risk-benefit ratio considerations, then of course the vaccine rollout started again. And so although there were a few cases of very serious side effects related to both the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccine, the benefit to the majority of people outweighed this risk. And so this is another important ethics consideration whenever research is reviewed, and a particularly important consideration when we look at pandemic ethics. Again, public health ethics being particularly important, and ensuring that as many lives as possible are saved, as much infection as possible is prevented. And it's just completely, an unfortunate event that a few people will experience very serious side effects. Now, on the 3rd of May, we heard that the first batch of Pfizer vaccines arrived in South Africa. And so we can see that, there is a trend towards increasing vaccine rollout in the country. And of course, despite many ethical challenges, we hope this vaccine rollout will continue and reach as many as possible. Having said that, we can see that Africa as a continent lags far behind many other countries in the world in terms of access to vaccines. And this in and of itself speaks of global health inequity that was sort of long-standing and predating the pandemic. This pandemic has clearly made it extremely visible in terms of who gets access to vaccines and who does not. Now, some have argued that African countries have reported such low numbers that maybe we don't really need the vaccines as much as other countries do. And so again, we go back to inequities at a global level. It is well known that many African countries have limited resources in terms of ability to test and report. And so the fact that there are low numbers reported in many African countries does not necessarily mean that that COVID-19 is not a problem in those countries. Of course, there are the odd countries here and there that are in denial in terms of COVID. This was also the case where HIV/AIDS is concerned. But on the whole, we know that many countries in Africa need vaccines, and that underreporting is an endemic problem on the continent. We are also aware that vaccine nationalism has been quite prominent, with both Canada and the United Kingdom having ordered many times more vaccine doses per person than was required in their countries. And this in itself has raised a global debate in terms of what Antonio Guterres from the United Nations describes as the tragic disconnect between self-interest and common interest. And to a large extent, the way in which vaccines have been made accessible around the world has raised contention in terms of equity at a global level. Now, throughout the course of this pandemic, we've experienced many other coexisting pandemics. And sadly, from a social perspective, we experienced the killing of George Floyd early on in the pandemic, which in itself raised questions around racism in the world in general, but also racism and its impact during COVID-19. And so to a large extent, people started to talk about twin pandemics. But then there was also gender injustice and environmental destruction and climate change and a host of other issues. And so the term syndemic surfaced again. It's not a new term. It was described by Meryl Singer in the mid-1990s already. And this is where we have an aggregation of two or more concurrent or sequential epidemics or disease clusters in a population with biological interactions which exacerbate the prognosis and burden of disease. And so in addition to all the biological disease we have circulating during this pandemic, we have so many other social determinants of health that are also impacting on how this pandemic unfolds. Many other diseases that are also of epidemic proportion in many countries, like tuberculosis, like HIV/AIDS, etc., also in existence at the same time. And so colliding pandemics is more accurate in terms of what we are dealing with. So to a large extent, the pandemic has surfaced a number of socio-cultural and biological challenges that the world is facing. It is therefore not surprising that despite many calls for us to return to normality, Arundhati Roy, who is a world-renowned author, has said that nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, we know that pandemics force us to break with traditional situations, and we have to therefore imagine things anew. And so we have to see the pandemic as a gateway between the old world and a new one. And so how do we actually, come to terms with leaving behind what we had before and moving forward to a different world? One important and positive impact of the pandemic was noted in northern India, where the Himalayas became visible after many, many decades, once again, as a result of reduced air travel, reduced pollution, etc. And so in many ways, the pandemic has unmasked things that we could not see before in many more ways than the physical. And so we have to think in terms of the lessons we've learned that have arisen out of the pandemic, and think about how we will recalibrate for life in a reimagined post-COVID world. We are far from a post-COVID world as things stand, with many countries still experiencing second waves, third waves, fourth waves of infection. And we hope that there will be a time when we have a post-COVID world to talk about. But what is really important is how we are going to build trust in this post-COVID world. And how we respond to the pandemic now is what will lay the basis for how we approach a post-COVID world. People have written extensively about the role of international governance health bodies like the World Health Organization. And clearly a number of reforms have been recommended in terms of how the WHO continues to function in its role going forward. Much work remains to be done in that respect. Solidarity has emerged as a really important principle in terms of how we relate to each other at an international level. And I think we're all quite clear that as long as the disease is in one country, the rest of the world is not safe. The current anxiety that many countries feel over the uncontrolled second wave in India is a clear example of that. Now, we often talk about herd immunity. Our president refers to herd immunity as population immunity. And we hope that with vaccines, a sufficient proportion of the population will receive a vaccine to create the so-called herd immunity or population immunity. But others have defined herd immunity differently. And they've described it in terms of resistance to the spread of poor health, not just becoming immune to a specific disease, but rather having the capacity for poor health to be eliminated at a global level. And of course, becoming immune to the negative social determinants of health. And that is described by Williams and Cooper in JAMA-Net in a very interesting article, which would make good reading for you if you're interested. And of course, we have this very important concept of intergenerational justice. Of course, this young lady, we know Greta Thunberg has become the poster girl for climate change and has made, considerable contributions at a global level to fighting for a better world for the youth of tomorrow. And so this raises a number of considerations for us in terms of the ethics of responsibility, the type of responsibility that we all carry for future generations and for the world that we leave behind. We know that this is a very famous Native American proverb, and it reminds us that we need to ensure that we leave the planet in a better condition for generations to come by, responsible cohabitation, but also ensuring, solidarity amongst the various nations of the world. And how we survive this pandemic will depend to a large extent on how we do this. Now, how has South Africa fared? I think it's time to go back to my title question and to respond to that. So I think to a large extent, the South African government has taken responsibility and has guided us and provided leadership in a way that has ensured that although we have had a few, we've had bad waves of outbreak, especially the second wave, on the whole, if we compare ourselves to many other countries, South Africa has done fairly well. The Department of Health and the South African government have not been perfect. They have made their fair share of errors in judgment. However, balancing the various medical, scientific, public health, economic, political, and social factors has meant that the government has walked a tightrope. This is not an easy task. It's easy for us to sit on the outside and critique. They have had a very, very difficult job. They've done well in some respects and not so well in others. But overall, I think our government, as well as South African society, has taken the pandemic fairly seriously. If you look around you when you go out, you will see that almost 85 to 90% of people are masking The sanitization rules are being followed everywhere. Businesses are taking this seriously because they've already experienced the impact economically of the pandemic. And so I think at many levels, I think we've done a fairly good job. There is room for improvement. For example, right now, the government ought to be thinking about our borders. Our airlines are not as strict as they should be in terms of symptom screening. The airports are doing a vague kind of temperature monitoring, which is insufficient. Airlines are fairly fully booked in terms of flights, etc. And we need to be screening foreign visitors much more carefully and much more tightly, especially given the current outbreak, the second wave in India, the dire situation in many South American countries. And so certainly one needs to become more careful and more vigilant in terms of ensuring that that we continue to keep South Africa as safe as we possibly can. At this point, I'm going to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Keymanthri, for that insightful journey around the various aspects of some of the ethical and social implications of this COVID pandemic. I really liked the way in which you brought in various facets of the way we have been exposed to the virus and the challenges we as members of the larger community have had to endure. I'm told by Renata that participants, if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand and she will give you access. So while you do that, if you want to comment as part of this discussion, please raise your hand and I will try to look at it and give you the floor. Keymanthri, earlier in your conversation, Tilo Govender asked a very interesting question. And I think to some extent you've answered it in the latter part, but let's take it as a question in its own. Could you please comment on the political decisions on healthcare and how can political decisions be subjected to public health ethical scrutiny? So that's the question by Tilu. You did cover a little bit of that at the end, but just let's revisit that for the moment.
Yeah, so that's an important question and certainly something that all of us have been discussing in the country. And as I said, it's this difficult balancing game between maintaining the economy and public health. Now, we have to also understand that from our perspective as clinicians, as public health physicians, we have a very clear agenda in terms of public health and it being a priority. And that's, the way it ought to be. But sort of looking at different perspectives is also important. There is the economy. And from our perspective, we would always say health trumps the economy. But one has to understand that the economy is an integral factor in terms of government decision-making, in terms of lives and livelihoods of, other people, ensuring that there is, supply, that supply meets demand in terms of other goods also required for functioning in society. And so ensuring, this balance is important. Another contentious factor, of course, is political gatherings, rallies, elections. In my opinion, that too is an important component of government and life in any country. However, one has to take into account the fact that we are in the midst of a pandemic and one has to minimize, exposure and harm to others. To a large extent, the current Modi government in India is being criticized for not paying adequate attention. And I would strongly urge you to read the article in the Maverick Insider. It's written by a professor from Pretoria who specializes in Indian politics. Very interesting piece. in terms of responsibility that leaders have in various countries. We know very well during the Easter long weekend in advance, our president was aware of the various religious gatherings that would occur over this Easter long weekend and made a very concerted effort, to ensure that gatherings were limited. He made a special appearance. He made great attempts and took effort to educate the public with respect to. So likewise, similarly, in India, there were religious gatherings over the last 3 to 4 weeks at a scale that is unknown to us, So those are the kind of things that one needed to step in as a leader. One needed to educate. One needed to ban certain events if necessary. As I said, and I'm talking across different religious gatherings and different religious belief systems. We know in South Africa that, people had restrictions in terms of attending churches, mosques, temples, all across the board. Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of approach that was necessary, without discriminating, without singling out a specific religious group or a specific cultural group. This is the type of approach one needs in a pandemic, and placing sort of public health at a central point for that period of time. And so I said earlier, canceling Christmas, may have been a good idea too. We had various ministerial advisory committees established, advising government. There was a little bit of controversy around some of those committees, how they were constituted, whether they were representative, and whether all their advice was necessarily being taken by government. So yes, contentious issues that arose, but I think we need to also see it in the context of having to make really difficult decisions when faced with what I would describe the pandemic as, as a wicked problem. Very difficult to find easy solutions.
Right. Isaac de Vries asks, if more screening or better screening were imposed on foreigners, would this not be seen as xenophobic?
I think at the time, under our current pandemic situation, as long as that screening process applied to all foreigners, that would be acceptable. The aim is not to single out a particular country. Obviously, if there's a top 10 list of countries,
yes,
the highest number of COVID cases, those are high-risk people to allow into the country. And certainly, I think one would be completely justified in being extremely strict with border controls, and not for only South Africa to do this, but for all countries in the world to do. So,
but Keymanthri, isn't it a requirement that a person subjects himself to a COVID test within so many hours of traveling? Is that not adequate, or do you possibly think that maybe you haven't done the test in the window period where you would get a legitimate outcome should you be traveling at that time? What's your thoughts on that?
Himla, you're correct, because one is not sure exactly at what point the test was done. There is asymptomatic transmission occurring. There are a whole host of the type of test that is done. In different countries is also variable in terms of how reliable they could or couldn't be. I think a combination of testing as well as a period of quarantine will be justified, especially if one is coming from a very high-risk country. Of course, it also a question around vaccine passports and the role that is going to play going forward with respect to international travel. Another very controversial topic. And people argue that, there will be discrimination again because of inequity in vaccine rollout across the world. So the more privileged countries will all have vaccines and vaccine passports, and less privileged countries will not. And so highly debatable. But again, when it comes, for decades, we've all had to produce a yellow fever that certificate when we travel to certain countries. So I think going forward, it will become, it may become a requirement, and how it is implemented, of course, is another matter.
Yes. Professor Leslie Swart, our editor of the South African Journal of Science, has said, thank you for an excellent presentation. And his question is, do you think that the pandemic offers an opportunity to mainstream disability exclusion as an issue into broader health discourse?
So thank you, Leslie. That's a very important question, and certainly one that has been highlighted during this pandemic. So I think as early on as access to critical care services, ICU beds, ventilators, etc., the aspect around how we actually take disability into account has become prominent. I would argue more prominent in other parts of the world than in South Africa, perhaps, because if you look at what we were using for triage in South Africa, the rubric included a clinical frailty score, and that in and of itself had the potential to discriminate against the disabled. So yes, it certainly has highlighted it, maybe not enough in South Africa, and certainly is an item to be placed on the agenda moving forward.
Keymanthri, the other point I would like to raise with you is around the mental states of us all during this pandemic. I mean, it's over a year now that we are subjecting ourselves to these confined spaces. I mean, you've highlighted the need for us to mask and to follow the rules and the regulation. But there is a bigger problem in that there are so many other emotional, psychological, and other issues that the pandemic has raised. And how do you, how would you do a scorecard of the mental state of individuals during these trying conditions?
Oh. So that's a tough question, Himla, because it's something that leaves nobody untouched. I mean, we're a society that is sort of accustomed to thinking about mental health problems as belonging to a certain sector of the community. So if you don't have a diagnosis, if you're not seeing a therapist, you're not seeing a psychiatrist, people think they're okay. But the pandemic has sort of leveled the playing field, because to a large extent, our mental health, all of us, our mental health has been challenged in so many ways by somewhat unusual circumstances. I was just observing my nephew the other day, and I realize there's a whole generation of what we call pandemic kids, who are being raised in isolation, who don't have friends, who not developing the appropriate social skills to interact with other children. So if we take it at that early stage of, look at pandemic children, look at pandemic teenagers, and of course adults and the elderly, who are also, super confined during this period, very isolated. I think across the spectrum, all age groups are impacted, all people are impacted, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of gender. With, of course, in many cases, women having the extra burden of lots of other challenges to deal with: domestic violence, domestic work, increased responsibilities at home, etc., child rearing instead of children going to school. So to a large extent, I think mental health issues are pervasive. They're affecting all of us. In some ways, they're probably making us a bit more sensitive to those who previously carried labels related to mental health.
Yeah. Keymanthri, there's one issue that you've touched on that I would like to pursue a little bit more. You mentioned issues around global health inequity, having its roots not only now during the pandemic, but being part of what we have experienced from a very long time. Prior to the pandemic, we would talk about the 80-20, the discrepancy in the developed versus the developing world and so on. And now we revisit the scenario with access to the vaccines. And you mentioned countries like the UK and Canada buying much more than they actually need, whereas others don't have it. And that, we need to share, because the pandemic will not go away unless everyone is protected. I understand that argument, and I also understand, and I've been following the kinds of discussions about the intellectual property, and people are putting forward issues about sharing, the technologies to make the vaccines, etc. Do you think if we had access to that intellectual property here in South Africa, on the African continent, that we are ready to produce vaccines? Because that part of the story is very rarely brought into the discussion when we talk about vaccine nationalism. So that's my first part. And the second thing is, despite everything we talk about in terms of our government's scorecard in how they have addressed the pandemic, the looting and corruption that has gone on, even with funds set aside for the Solidarity Fund in support in South Africa, has yet again presented his head. Yesterday while I was driving, I heard that Eskom pays up to 100 Rand for a toilet roll through their processes of securing things. So from an ethical perspective, and also, you've got legal and all these other backgrounds in your head. How would you, to an average person on the street, try to unpack what we in the bigger sphere talk about global nationalism, etc., in the context of South Africa?
Okay, so Himla, the first question I think relates to vaccine manufacturing capacity in South Africa and on the continent. The African continent has a poor history in terms of vaccine manufacturing capacity. I think the only country that has manufactured vaccines is Senegal and the yellow fever vaccine. South Africa has not. There is a discussion around, Aspen and a local manufacturing process. But I think when we talk about manufacturing, we have to distinguish between manufacturing from scratch, manufacturing an actual vaccine, and fill and finish, where, the vaccine comes in from elsewhere and you simply put it into vials and distribute. So different levels of vaccine manufacturing capacity are important to consider. And clearly it's been decades and we have not developed much vaccine manufacturing committee. Department of Science and Innovation needs to answer for that. The Department of Health needs to answer for that. These are long-standing problems and cannot be fixed in the midst of a pandemic. Likewise, there are many questions around patents and technology sharing. But I think one has to think very carefully about patenting and how it actually works with respect to vaccines. Again, it's not a quick fix because vaccines are classified as biologics, and this has a whole lot of implications where regulators are concerned. So to get sort of generic biologics, there are a number of rules in place, to produce a biosimilar vaccine. It is not as straightforward as just saying, get rid of patents. That's not going to solve the current problem we have with respect to vaccine manufacture. Technology sharing certainly is an option. We've already seen a few of the big pharmaceutical companies, engaging in collaborative agreements where I think it's either AstraZeneca and Merck and similar kind of combinations have shared technology to speed up vaccine development. The story of India is quite an interesting one. The Serum Institute of India is one of the largest vaccine manufacturers in the world, located in a low middle income country. And it's very sad because India has been manufacturing vaccines, sending it out abroad, yet, the Indian nationals themselves do not have adequate access to vaccines. So you can see a very interesting, way in which this is playing out. Where a low middle income country is becoming a vaccine supplier for the rest of the world at the expense of its own people. And certainly one needs to take that into account as well. I think there's great potential for the African continent, and we need to work harder at, looking at ways to improve our own vaccine manufacturing capacity. With respect to corruption, Himla, I think from an ethics perspective, there's no debate. Completely unacceptable, completely unethical. It happened with respect to PPE, more directly related to the pandemic. It's happened in other forms in industry, in government, all completely unacceptable. And it all comes to leadership, responsible leadership. Because at the end of the day, that is what helps in terms of how well one does. So how have we fared with respect to the pandemic? Yeah. Look at countries in the world where leadership has been robust and ethical and good, and to see the positive impact in those countries. And then we need to look at other countries in the world where leadership has been a problem. And the outcome is quite clear. So I think there's just absolutely no doubt that one cannot at any level find corruption acceptable.
Yeah. You also mentioned that the prevalence of the pandemic elsewhere on the African continent, while the peaks follow the South African bimodal first wave and second wave, and I think one other African country has a third wave. But if you look at the y-axis, the number of people affected, the Southern African region far exceeds the rest of the African continent. I agree that maybe testing and so forth elsewhere is not as robust as is in South Africa. What would you attribute other than the testing? Because we haven't heard major incidences elsewhere on the African continent as we have in our own country. What would you attribute the lower numbers over and above the lack of capacity to test elsewhere in the African continent? Because if you look at the socio-economic situation, we're much better off to the rest of the African continent. And I mean, even where the Africa CDC talks about these issues, and the problems elsewhere in Africa, why is it that South Africa went to the extent in the growth of the numbers that we have seen?
Himla, that's an important and interesting question, and I'm sure we've all been thinking about it from time to time. There's a lot that's different about Africa compared to the rest of the world, I think, in terms of the burden of disease we carry in various countries. So on the African continent, I think people also develop immunity over time, having more exposure to sort of more infectious agents over time. Perhaps it's an immunity question. Perhaps it's our vitamin D and our exposure to the sun. There's a whole range of traditional African medicines that are used by people on a day-to-day basis. We don't know much about that. We know that traditional African medicine is seriously neglected from a science perspective. We've all followed the Western allopathic way, but one has to ask questions about why supplies of ginger ran out so quickly during the pandemic, even in South Africa, why we're paying 400 Rand a kilo for fresh ginger. So there were these home remedies that were circulating widely. Artemisia, widely used also in Africa. People making their own concoctions, perhaps not to cure COVID, but to boost immunity. And we really don't know enough about how that works. Then, of course, one has to understand that in terms of international travel, many countries in the South, have become a hub for travel. Yes. So we have South African Airways used to be, major international player. Ethiopian Airlines, likewise, another very big international flyer on the continent. And the amount of international movement, on the continent is also related to how developed these airlines are, where they're located, what their flying routes are. So how infection spreads, is linked to that to a certain extent. So I think there are a number of interesting questions. We certainly need to look into that in more detail. But also even within South Africa, we need to look into the fact that there were some families where 4 members developed COVID, yes, but not. Now again, that's your field, Himla, and I won't go there. But why is it that some people have a level of resistance to COVID and others do not? So I think many important scientific questions yet to be answered. And we will, only see how they unfold in the passage of time, with the passage of time.
No, for sure. I know we're running out of time, but Mandy Smallhorn, who's a science journalist, has asked a question. And she says, last year, there was much talk of building back better globally. And I had hopes that we had learned lessons about the character of healthcare and some other essential services. That is not a commodity. It needs to be managed differently. The question is, do you feel that the concept of building back better has staying power, or is it falling by the wayside as the whole vaccine nationalism thing seems to indicate? Over to you.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. The entire debate around how vaccines have been distributed in the world is highly contentious. We have the World Health Organization. They did set up a COVAX facility, but somehow I think that wasn't enough. My personal opinion is that we ought to have had a system globally that ensured that at least all high-risk people got vaccines first globally, instead of one country, yes, like being 100% vaccinated and having no active cases for 10 days, but rather having the scenario of vaccines being deployed to all countries in terms of accessing their healthcare workers first, ensuring we have a very limited and precious healthcare service provider pool, and we need to preserve that. And so that would have been, the first line of action, and then moving down the line to other people who are at high risk. That way we covered risk levels across the globe instead of this patchy vaccine distribution that we have at the moment. And I really think a global health organization like WHO, United Nations, UNESCO had a role to play in that right at the outset. And that did not happen.
Yeah. Keymanthri, we could go on listening to you. You are such an insightful, encyclopedic resource of knowledge. And not only that, you are able to contextualize for all of us in a very eloquent way of understanding the depth of problems and the way in which we as a society should show those kinds of humanitarian qualities that we learned about as the basics in ethics to espouse during such trying circumstances. There have been a few comments around the chats thanking you for your excellent presentation. And I wish on behalf of all the participants to thank you, really knowing how busy your schedule is, to have afforded us the opportunity to listen to what you have to say and challenging us to think about the global pandemic with respect to SARS-CoV-2, but also the other kind of issues related to gender, to race, and the global environment, etc., that we need to be bringing into our consciousness to be better citizens and to contribute in that respect. I'm pleased to say I haven't confirmed a date, but the next in conversation would be with Kevin Govender and Vanessa McBride, and that topic is going to be on astronomy. That's another passion that I have, and I believe with all the trips going up to Mars, etc., I want to extend the conversation to beyond into the universe. And so if any of you could think of some topics that you would like for me to invite people, please share that with me, either directly to my own email or to my colleague, Renata. And let's keep the conversation going. So on behalf of all of us, Keymanthri, I want to thank you once again, and hopefully we will continue to be inspired by your insightful knowledge and wisdom as we read and follow the work that you're doing. Thank you all so much, and until we meet again, have a good one. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.